How's everybody today? This is Pete here at Spawn Fly Fish, and wanted to give you guys a little extra time on getting ready for the ant hatch for the summertime. So in the vise we've got a core, this is series 1120, and this is a size 12, which is a little bit big, but we're not going to utilize the entire shank. We're just going to barely come down on that curved section. So to start, I've got some ultra thread, and this is red. And what I'm going to do is just get my thread started on here and get that tag end out. And then we're going to add in some wires and start tying up a wire-bodied ant that is meant to fish under the surface and is very effective on trout. And you can get into some panfish if you enjoy catching panfish on the fly. This is the way to go. So now we've got some ultra wire size small, and this is color red, and I've actually got two pieces here. And the reason for the two pieces is I think it's much easier to control your wraps with two wires versus one that you're going to kind of fight for a while and try to keep it next to itself. So go ahead and just tie in two wires from the get-go and you won't have any of those issues. As far as spacing and size of the body sections, we want to keep this middle very open for some legs that we're going to add in, or the illusion of legs. And so if I keep this as my rear portion, and then roughly from where this red thread ends all the way to the front as the head, I won't have to crowd, and there will be a clear separation of the body segments. So for this, to get the shape right, because we're all pretty familiar with the shape of an ant, and you do need that clear distinction between the front section and the rear section. So what I'm going to do here is I've flattened my thread a little bit, and I'm going to just patiently go back and forth and overlap these wraps until I've built up a sort of cylindrical, almost egg-shaped underbody. And it doesn't have to be huge, because not only are we going to wrap two wires over that underbody, we're also going to hit it with some resin when we're done. And so that's going to, allow us to tie like a slender body, but then bulk it up to your exact likings with the resin. So there are some options here. And as far as an underbody goes, this is getting there. You can start to see where we're getting that shape of an elongated egg, for a lack of a better term. And I think we're going to call it good right about here. Just come up, and we'll tie these wires off here after we wrap them. Alright, so that's a pretty decent underbody. I'm happy with that shape and size. As you can see, it's not huge, but it's going to do what we need it to do. So go ahead and get that thread out of there, a couple wraps. We can back that up when we're ready. So now we have our two red wires tied in here. So be patient when you're wrapping wire. I'm going to turn this hook a little bit so I can see this first wrap. And then while you're wrapping this, if you can maintain some constant pressure, and that's nothing really strong, but you also don't want it so weak that it can leave gaps in the between, then maintain that tension in your fingers as you wrap these wires. And if you're patient, take your time and look at it, where they're hitting on that underbody, just right next to the previous wraps. As you go up, you can kind of scoot these back too if you really have a big gap. But that's why we're using red thread underneath this. Is if there is a little space between your wires, it's not going to be nearly as noticeable. And I think on this next wrap, we're going to tie these off and call that rear section done. So I'm going to back that thread up 2 wraps, come in here, flatten on top, and then get my thread to start doing some work for me. There's 1 and 2, 3 wraps to get that wire solidified, and then we're going to very cleanly come in with our scissor tips and trim those wires out. I'm just going to flatten the ends where we cut those, being careful not to knock that thread, because that could still dislodge where those wires finish. Now just a couple wraps over those trimmed ends, and we are ready for our first whip finish. And don't be concerned with the red thread on the shank here, because guess what? We're coming in with another thread and we're going to cover all that up anyway. Alright, so now for the next thread, we've got some Veevus 12/0, and this is black thread. And all we're going to do is get it started on here and come back to where we tied off our wire from the butt section. So right about here, I've got a whiting saddle hackle feather, and this is black, and it's pretty thin, so you can see if we looked at it as far as legs, they're just right. But what I'm going to do is remove, as I look at the top of the feather, these will be the right hand fibers. And what that'll do is if I tie this feather in by the base with the concave side facing the hook, when I start to wrap, the fibers on the left side of the convex or top side are going to release off of that when I wrap it, and then we'll have this illusion of just enough legs to get the fish interested in what we're offering. And you know, luckily for us, fish aren't very good at counting, so the number of legs doesn't always have to be exact. And so let's get this tied in. And as far as the number of wraps here we're going to look for, it's somewhere between 1 and 2. I know that seems a little odd, but as far, you'll see once we start to wrap this, how it releases those fibers is going to sort of dictate how many wraps we use. Alright, so now as I wrap this, the darker or convex side of each fiber is going to be facing forward, and that's what we want, and that's not as much for the fish as it is for the fisher person. So there we've got one wrap, so by the time I've come up to the top again, it'll be essentially 1.5 wraps. And so let's go ahead and call that good and get this tied off. Try to keep that thread close to the previous wrap without mashing down any of those fibers. I want to get a wrap in front of the feather now, and I can trim that butt section out. Nothing to it. Let's get a little cleaner on a couple of those. And so as you can see, it's very sparse, but in the water it's going to give just enough movement that the fish will go, yep, that bug's moving, it's alive, I better get to it before it gets away from me. Alright, so now all we need to do is sort of repeat the step that we did for the tail, but instead of the tail or butt section, we're going to tie in the head now. And so for the head, it's the same idea, but we're doing a two-toned ant. And so in the front, we're going to have black wire, and again, I'm using 2 size small ultra wires just because I find it much easier controlling those wires if there are 2 instead of 1. And don't worry about mashing down these legs or any of that, because we're going to address it as we tie these wires on top here. And I do want those even, and I don't want any of it sticking out toward the eye of the hook when we go to finish. So I'm going to trim that again, and now we'll start. I'm going to move that thread up a couple wraps and keep those wires on top of the body. Alright, and that's about as far as I need to go back. We're not going to have as much of an underbody up here because the head is, you know, a little smaller than the rear section here on an ant. So just keep that in mind. We don't have to go crazy on this underbody. And one thing to keep in mind too, when you're making these underbodies for your wire to follow, if you go real big and have a bump in the middle that really stands out, the wire's going to have trouble keeping up as you wrap forward, and you'll end up with more spacing between the wires than you typically would like to see. And again, And just tie a couple thousand of them if you have any questions, and by the end of a couple thousand, you'll have everything answered. All right, and toward the front, and let's wrap this head. And so, same deal, coming over. I'm not going to turn it, so hopefully this is lining up on your side pretty well so you guys can see how this comes together. Right there, you can see as we start to wrap on the decline of our underbody, how it wants to just slide off. And so that's, again, the importance of not going crazy on the underbody. The difference in the size really makes a difference for how that wire comes off. And there we have the magical broken thread. And let's see if this wire will stay there for me. So this is great because this is what happens as fly tyers. You know, the wire is going to help us out and hold the position a little bit for us while we restart our thread. So the point being, don't freak out. Just take a little breath, calm your nerves, and rethread the thread, and you're in business. So not only did we break the thread, we actually had it wrapped around the outside of the spool. So we are really batting 1,000 today on this fly. I hope you guys enjoy that we just keep tying when we break thread. We could obviously just turn the camera off and reshoot, but this is what happens in real situations, and we want you guys to have full advantage that we make mistakes too. So I'm going to just sneak in here and start that thread again underneath in front of the eye, trim out that tag end, and now I'm going to carefully take one wrap over the previous piece of thread that broke. Now I can turn that to me, trim it out, and as long as you guys don't tell on me, no one will ever know. Alright, a couple more thread wraps, solidify that wire, and let's call that good. Carefully trim those wires out, like so. Again, the thumb is very useful. Just flatten out that cut edge. And now we'll get a couple thread wraps over those trimmed edges. But we don't want to go too many because then we kind of ruin the illusion of our wire body here. Alright, like so. And now let's add a couple whip finishes. You could actually just get one in there because we are going to resin up this body. And trim out the thread. Alright, so as you can see, pretty sharp little ant, really simple, just take your time. But now that we've gotten it this far, let's resin this bad boy up and you can see it come to life a little more. And the name of the game here is err on the side of too little resin, especially on this first pass, because when you hit this with the light, if you're unable to get it to cure or set completely before you add a second layer, that first layer, you know, pretty much just never dry out, and the moisture will try to evaporate through all the other layers of resin, and so what you'll end up with is tack. So keeping that in mind, we're just going to do enough to coat all the important pieces here of this little ant, and you can see the black almost disappears, so you can't even see that it's wire underneath, which is fine. The whole point of this fly is to give them something subsurface when there is an ant hatch, and even when there's not an ant hatch, there is a very strong familiarity with an ant because fish see them different times throughout the year. Just because we're not on the water, you know, for whatever reason, we might not see one of the ant hatches. So I'm just going to give it a quick cure here, and for the resin we're using some Loon UV clear, and this is the thin resin, one of my favorites. Alright, and that's gonna do it. I don't think we need a second coat of resin on here. I like the way this looks. It's got the dual tone for, you know, easy for the fish to find this in the water. The red kind of acts as a little beacon, and they see, oh yeah, legs, head, must be a bug, let me eat that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them below in the comment section. And tie up a bunch of these, go catch a bunch of fish, and we will see you guys on the water.